What if your child got sick and a doctor's diagnosis made you the prime suspect for a crime you didn't commit? This isn't a nightmare. It's the terrifying reality behind shaken baby syndrome, a diagnosis that, for decades, sent innocent parents to prison based on 3 symptoms alone. No witness, no proof, just a medical theory. This is what happened to Sarah Mitchell, and what her story reveals about our justice system should scare us all. It was a chilly autumn morning when Sarah noticed something wrong with her infant daughter. The baby was unusually drowsy, refusing to eat. Then suddenly, she went limp in Sarah's arms. Panicked, Sarah called 911. Paramedics rushed the child to the ER. Sarah did what any parent would do. She begged the doctors to save her baby's life. But instead of comfort, she was met with suspicion. Within hours, doctors told police that the baby showed the classic triad of symptoms of shaken baby syndrome. To them, the science was clear. This wasn't an accident. It was abuse. And the abuser, they claimed, was Sarah. Think about that. A mother calls for help when her child collapses, and by the end of the day, she's in handcuffs. No bruises, no history of violence, only the diagnosis. Sarah's nightmare had begun. But what police and prosecutors didn't reveal was that these very same medical symptoms can be caused by dozens of other conditions, from accidental falls to undiagnosed illnesses. And that truth, hidden for decades, would later change everything. It makes you wonder, if medicine can be this wrong in the courtroom, how many other so-called scientific certainties have sent innocent people to prison? Drop your thoughts below. By the time Sarah Mitchell was allowed to see her daughter again, the hospital room wasn't filled with doctors, it was filled with detectives. She thought they were there to ask about her baby's medical history. But their questions weren't about symptoms. They were accusations. Did you shake her? Did you lose control? Just admit it. We can help you if you tell the truth. Sarah had no idea that the words spoken by one doctor, shaken baby syndrome, had already sealed her fate. To police and prosecutors, SBS was as conclusive as DNA. If the triad was present, then the caregiver was guilty. Case closed. And so the interrogation began. For hours, detectives pushed her. They showed her pictures of her unconscious child. They told her doctors had proved the injuries could only come from violent shaking. They painted her as a monster, a danger to her own baby. At first, Sarah denied everything. She explained the sudden collapse, the weeks of strange drowsiness her daughter had shown, even a minor fall days earlier. But each word was dismissed. The officers leaned in closer. Falls don't cause this. You're lying. Tell us what you did. This wasn't just questioning. It was psychological warfare, the same methods used to extract false confessions in other wrongful conviction cases. Sarah was exhausted, terrified, and desperate to prove she wasn't a threat. And then came the turning point. One detective slid a piece of paper across the table. If you just write down that you shook her, this will all go easier for you. Sarah refused. But the damage was done. The next morning, police arrested her for first-degree child abuse, a charge that would soon escalate to murder when her baby didn't survive. No forensic testing, no alternative explanations, just a diagnosis. Sarah went from grieving mother to accused killer. But what prosecutors didn't reveal at trial was this. Even at the very moment Sarah was being interrogated, cracks were already forming in the so-called science of shaken baby syndrome. A handful of researchers were beginning to question the triad, warning that real-world medicine was far more complicated than the courtroom claimed. And those warnings, ignored in Sarah's case, would soon explode into one of the most controversial battles in modern forensic science. If you were in Sarah's shoes, accused of a crime you didn't commit, but told the science was undeniable, would you keep fighting or would you break? Let me know in the comments. By the time Sarah Mitchell was allowed to see her daughter again, the hospital room wasn't filled with doctors, it was filled with detectives. She thought they were there to ask about her baby's medical history, but their questions weren't about symptoms. They were accusations. Did you shake her? Did you lose control? Just admit it. We can help you if you tell the truth. Sarah had no idea that the words spoken by one doctor, shaken baby syndrome, had already sealed her fate. To police and prosecutors, SBS was as conclusive as DNA. If the triad was present, then the caregiver was guilty. Case closed. And so the interrogation began. For hours, detectives pushed her. They showed her pictures of her unconscious child. They told her doctors had proved the injuries could only come from violent shaking. They painted her as a monster, a danger to her own baby. At first, Sarah denied everything. She explained the sudden collapse, the weeks of strange drowsiness her daughter had shown, even a minor fall days earlier. But each word was dismissed. The officers leaned in closer. Falls don't cause this. You're lying. Tell us what you did. This wasn't just questioning. It was psychological warfare, the same methods used to extract false confessions in other wrongful conviction cases. Sarah was exhausted, terrified, and desperate to prove she wasn't a threat. And then came the turning point. One detective slid a piece of paper across the table. If you just write down that you shook her, this will all go easier for you. Sarah refused. But the damage was done. The next morning, police arrested her for first-degree child abuse, a charge that would soon escalate to murder when her baby didn't survive. No forensic testing, no alternative explanations, just a diagnosis. Sarah went from grieving mother to accused killer. But what prosecutors didn't reveal at trial was this. Even at the very moment Sarah was being interrogated, cracks were already forming in the so-called science of shaken baby syndrome. A handful of researchers were beginning to question the triad, warning that real-world medicine was far more complicated than the courtroom claimed. And those warnings, ignored in Sarah's case, would soon explode into one of the most controversial battles in modern forensic science. If you were in Sarah's shoes, accused of a crime you didn't commit, but told the science was undeniable, would you keep fighting or would you break? Let me know in the comments. When Sarah Mitchell's trial began, the courtroom wasn't filled with murder weapons, DNA evidence, or eyewitnesses. It was filled with medical charts, x-rays, and the voices of doctors who claimed they held the truth. The prosecution's case was devastating in its simplicity. The baby had brain swelling. The baby had bleeding behind the eyes. The baby had bleeding on the surface of the brain. The triad. And to the jury, that triad meant only one thing. Sarah had shaken her baby to death. What the jury didn't know was that the triad itself was built on assumption, not proof. Decades earlier, doctors observed these injuries in children who were admitted for suspected abuse. Over time, correlation was transformed into causation. Medical textbooks began to say, these three symptoms equal shaking. And once that belief hardened into dogma, it became almost impossible to challenge. By the time Sarah was on trial, the triad wasn't just a diagnosis. It was a conviction in waiting. One pediatrician, polished and authoritative, looked directly at the jury and declared, these injuries could not be caused by a short fall. They could not be caused by illness. They could only be caused by violent shaking. I am 100% certain. The words landed like a hammer, and Sarah's fate was sealed. Her defense attorney tried to push back. They called their own experts who suggested alternative explanations, bleeding disorders, hidden infections, even accidental trauma. But compared to the certainty of the prosecution's doctors, those doubts sounded weak. The jury wanted answers, not uncertainty. And the medical establishment had given prosecutors the perfect weapon, the illusion of scientific certainty. The trial became a battle of narratives. On one side, a grieving mother. On the other, experts in white coats, testifying with absolute confidence. And when confidence collides with grief in a courtroom, confidence usually wins. After only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. Sarah collapsed, sobbing, as deputies placed her in handcuffs. But what no one told the jury, and what the prosecution refused to acknowledge, was that around the country, New science was emerging that cast doubt on every word spoken from that witness stand. Science that would one day expose how fragile, how dangerous, and how deeply flawed the foundation of shaken baby syndrome truly was. Do you think juries should be allowed to convict on medical testimony alone, without physical evidence or witnesses? Let me know your thoughts below. For Sarah Mitchell, the trial was over, but the real sentence was just beginning. She entered prison not as a hardened criminal, but as a grieving mother branded a murderer. Everywhere she went, whispers followed her. Inmates who had heard her story turned away in disgust. Guards looked at her with contempt. Because in the eyes of the world, there is no crime more monstrous than killing your own child. Inside those concrete walls, Sarah lived in constant fear, not just of the violence around her, but of the crushing isolation that came from being labeled the worst kind of killer. She wrote letters to her family, begging them to believe her. Some responded with support. Others couldn't bear the shame. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Sarah clung to routines. She worked in the prison laundry. She spent hours in the library, reading books on medicine and law, desperate to understand the science that had condemned her. And every night, she replayed the same questions in her mind. What had really happened to her baby? Why had no one listened? How could a diagnosis be enough to destroy her life? What Sarah didn't know was that beyond those prison walls, a battle was beginning to take shape. A handful of doctors, forensic pathologists, and legal advocates were starting to push back against the so-called certainty of shaken baby syndrome. They argued that the triad of symptoms wasn't a smoking gun at all, that illnesses like meningitis, genetic disorders, or even minor accidents could produce the same injuries. But in 2003, 2005, even 2010, their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming chorus of medical orthodoxy. And so, while Sarah studied and prayed for justice, the system remained deaf to her cries. Still, her case wasn't forgotten. A single defense lawyer, unsettled by the inconsistencies in her trial, kept digging. And years later, what he uncovered, buried in medical journals and ignored expert testimony, would begin to unravel everything. But Sarah's suffering in prison would stretch nearly a decade before the first cracks in her case began to show. Can you imagine serving years in prison, hated by everyone around you, for a crime you know you didn't commit? How long would you hold on to hope? While Sarah Mitchell sat in a prison cell, her case wasn't just confined to the courtroom. It spilled out into the streets, into the headlines, into the living rooms of families across the nation. Mother convicted of shaking baby to death. Justice for innocent infant. Killer mom sentenced. The story was simple, horrifying, and impossible to ignore. A parent turned predator. And to a public already primed by fear, it confirmed their darkest suspicions that monsters could live in their own homes. By the early 2000s, shaken baby syndrome had become more than a medical diagnosis. It was a cultural phenomenon. Hospitals produced training videos showing dolls violently shaken as warnings to new parents. Posters lined pediatric offices with grim statistics. Prosecutors gave press conferences declaring their crusade to protect the innocent. No one questioned the science. No one asked whether the diagnosis itself was built on shaky ground. And so, Sarah's conviction wasn't seen as controversial. It was seen as justice. But here's the truth the public never heard. The epidemic of shaken baby syndrome was largely created by medical experts who insisted the triad could mean only one thing. Their testimony filled courtrooms. Their warnings filled parenting classes. And the media, hungry for fear, hungry for villains, turned those medical opinions into absolute fact. A fact that destroyed lives. For Sarah, the consequences were crushing. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a pariah. Her community cut ties. Friends stopped writing. Even some family members, swayed by the relentless drumbeat of science and certainty, turned their backs. Her name was synonymous with guilt. and her baby's memory was forever bound to a crime that never happened. But behind the scenes, something was beginning to stir. A few brave doctors and lawyers started whispering the unthinkable. What if we've been wrong? What if those 3 symptoms weren't proof of abuse at all? And what if hundreds, even thousands, of innocent parents were sitting in prison cells, just like Sarah, condemned by nothing more than a flawed diagnosis? When the media and experts agree on something, do you think the public should question it more? Or is it safer to trust the consensus? Share your thoughts below. While Sarah Mitchell counted years behind bars, outside her prison walls a different battle was brewing. One fought not in courtrooms, but in laboratories, medical journals, and hushed academic debates. It began with a question that few dared to ask. If shaking alone caused the triad of symptoms, why were doctors beginning to see those same injuries in children who had never been shaken at all? In London, neuropathologists documented infants who collapsed suddenly from rare illnesses, meningitis, metabolic disorders, even clotting diseases. Autopsies revealed the same bleeding, the same swelling, the same retinal hemorrhages, all without a single sign of abuse. Meanwhile, in the US, emergency room physicians noticed another problem. Short accidental falls, once dismissed as harmless, were sometimes producing severe brain injuries, even deaths. The triad, once thought to be exclusive to shaking, was appearing in case after case of accidents and natural disease. The foundation of shaken baby syndrome was starting to crack. In 2001, a group of researchers began quietly publishing papers warning that the science behind SBS was dangerously overstated. They argued that what prosecutors called infallible was in fact deeply uncertain. But their warnings weren't welcomed. For every doctor who questioned SBS, there were dozens ready to silence them. Prosecutors mocked them as defense hacks. Medical boards accused them of undermining child safety. Some were threatened with professional ruin. Because once science hardens into dogma, challenging it isn't just unpopular, it's dangerous. Yet their work kept spreading, whispered among defense attorneys, tucked into appellate briefs, and handed to families desperate to prove their innocence. And then, one case, thousands of miles from Sarah's prison cell, would begin to show just how fragile the prosecution's medical certainty really was. A case where a single overlooked piece of evidence would change everything. Do you think scientific experts should ever testify with 100% certainty in court? Or should doubt always be acknowledged? Drop your answer below. In 2008, the case of Audrey Edmonds in Wisconsin broke open a quiet revolution. Edmonds, a young mother and babysitter, had been convicted years earlier of shaking a baby to death. The prosecution's evidence? The same triad of symptoms: brain swelling, subdural bleeding, retinal hemorrhages. Doctors swore under oath that these injuries could only mean one thing: violent shaking. The jury believed them. Audrey was sentenced to 18 years in prison. But then something happened that no one expected. By the time Audrey's appeals reached the Wisconsin Supreme Court, the scientific landscape had changed. Over a dozen new studies had been published, showing that the triad wasn't so airtight after all. Short falls, undiagnosed illnesses, even birth trauma could produce the very same findings once thought to be exclusive to abuse. And when the justices compared the old trial testimony against the new science, they reached a chilling conclusion. The jury had convicted Audrey Edmonds based on medical testimony that was no longer considered reliable. Her conviction was overturned. For the first time, a high court admitted what defense lawyers had been saying for years. The supposed certainty of SBS was anything but certain. Headlines exploded. Shaken baby conviction overturned. Defense attorneys began digging into their old case files. Parents and caregivers across the country, once branded as monsters, saw a sliver of hope. But not everyone was celebrating. Prosecutors warned of a floodgate effect. Child abuse pediatricians doubled down, insisting that SBS remained valid, even if the science was being misunderstood. And quietly, Behind closed doors, a new battle line was being drawn between those clinging to the old dogma and those demanding the truth. But the Edmonds case was just the beginning, because the next wave of cases would expose an even darker truth: that some prosecutors knew the science was shifting and still fought to keep innocent parents behind bars. And one mother's story would prove just how far the system was willing to go to defend a crumbling diagnosis. Do you think courts should revisit every conviction built on shaken baby syndrome testimony? Or would that be opening Pandora's box? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious what you think. Her name was Jennifer Delpreet, a daycare worker in Illinois, described by parents as warm, patient, and loving. She had no history of violence, no warning signs, no dark secrets. But in December of 2002, everything changed. One morning, while Jennifer was caring for an infant, the child suddenly collapsed. Jennifer called 911 in a panic. Paramedics rushed the baby to the hospital. But when doctors saw the now familiar triad of brain swelling, subdural bleeding, and retinal hemorrhages, the conclusion seemed automatic. They declared it shaken baby syndrome. And suddenly, Jennifer wasn't seen as a caring daycare provider anymore. She was branded a child killer. Prosecutors painted her as a woman who snapped. They told the jury she lost her temper, shook the baby violently, then lied about it. Their star witnesses? Doctors, specialists, child abuse experts. They testified with certainty. There is no other explanation for these injuries. And the jury believed them. Jennifer Delpreet was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Behind bars, Jennifer refused to accept that this was her fate. She wrote letters. She begged lawyers to look at her case. She told anyone who would listen, "I didn't hurt that baby. I love that baby." But in the early 2000s, the science of SBS was still considered gospel. Appeals were dismissed. Courts wouldn't listen. It seemed hopeless. Then, years later, something remarkable happened. Jennifer's case caught the attention of the Medill Innocence Project at Northwestern University. A team of investigative journalists and lawyers began digging through the evidence. And what they found shocked them. Hidden deep in hospital records, buried from the jury, was a crucial fact. The baby had pre-existing medical conditions. Conditions that could explain the symptoms without any shaking at all. But prosecutors never shared this with the defense. They had withheld evidence. The cornerstone of Jennifer's conviction, that only shaking could cause the injuries, began to crumble. And in 2014, after 12 long years in prison, Jennifer Delpreet was freed on bond. She was later fully exonerated. Jennifer's story was more than just a victory. It was proof that wrongful convictions in SBS cases weren't hypothetical. They were real. They had names, faces, families. And if Jennifer could be accused, convicted, and nearly spend her life in prison for a crime she didn't commit, how many others were still locked away? Because while Jennifer walked free, there were hundreds of other parents still behind bars. And the system that put them there, it wasn't about to admit it was wrong. In fact, it was preparing to fight harder than ever. If a jury hears medical testimony that sounds certain, do you think they can ever see past it? Or is the expert always going to win? Drop your thoughts below. For decades, the diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome was treated as undeniable fact. Doctors testified with absolute certainty. Prosecutors leaned on their words like sacred scripture. And juries, lacking medical training, accepted it without question. But science, unlike the courtroom, evolves. And cracks were beginning to show. The first wave of dissent came quietly. A handful of pediatric neuropathologists, radiologists, and biomechanical engineers started asking difficult questions. They noticed that the so-called triad of injuries, brain swelling, retinal hemorrhages, and subdural bleeding, was not unique to shaking. It could also be caused by short falls, by birth trauma, by blood disorders, by infections, by accidents so minor they wouldn't even seem dangerous. But in courtrooms across America, these possibilities were dismissed. The dominant voices declared, Only violent shaking can explain this. One of the earliest voices to challenge the consensus was Dr. Norman Guthkelch, the British neurosurgeon who first described shaken baby syndrome in the 1970s. Decades later, near the end of his life, he admitted something chilling. He said his theory had been stretched far beyond what the evidence supported. That prosecutors and medical experts had turned a hypothesis into a hammer, smashing lives with scientific certainty that was never truly certain. The father of shaken baby syndrome himself began to question the way his idea was being weaponized. And if even Guthkelch was raising doubts, how could the courts continue to pretend the science was unshakable? By the early 2000s, new research began to expose serious problems with SBS testimony. Biomechanical studies showed that shaking alone, without impact, was unlikely to generate enough force to cause the injuries described. Autopsy reviews revealed that the triad could appear in children who were never abused. And peer-reviewed journals started publishing papers warning that the certainty of SBS was, at best, overstated. At worst, it was junk science. Defense attorneys began to call these scientists as witnesses. Trials that once seemed open and shut now turned into bitter battles between experts. One doctor would insist, "This can only be shaking." Another would counter, "No, there are multiple medical explanations." And juries, for the first time, started to hesitate. The certainty that once guaranteed convictions was no longer so certain. But here's the problem. Even as the science shifted, many prosecutors refused to accept it. They doubled down. They insisted that any challenge to SBS was part of a defense lawyer conspiracy. And medical examiners who dared to speak against the orthodoxy, they were ridiculed, blacklisted, labeled as defense hacks. The system had become addicted to SBS testimony. It was too convenient, too powerful in front of a jury. To admit the science was flawed would mean admitting that thousands of convictions might be unsafe. And for prosecutors, police, and even some doctors, that was unthinkable. But what they didn't realize was this. The very resistance to new science would fuel something bigger. A growing movement of lawyers, scientists, and wrongfully convicted parents who refused to be silenced. And soon, the battle over shaken baby syndrome would erupt into open war, in appellate courts, scientific journals, and the headlines of national newspapers. And that war was only just beginning. Do you think the justice system should revisit every conviction when science evolves? Or should finality matter more than truth? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your take. By the time the first scientific cracks appeared in the foundation of shaken baby syndrome, hundreds of parents and caregivers were already serving long prison sentences. For them, hope came not in the form of medical breakthroughs, but in the slow, grinding wheels of the appellate courts. Appeals are not new trials. They aren't about innocence or guilt. They're about legal error. And that meant for the wrongfully convicted, the challenge was immense. How do you convince judges to reconsider science that the justice system itself had canonized as truth? In case after case, defense lawyers argued that the triad of symptoms was not proof of abuse. They presented affidavits from medical experts, biomechanical engineers, and neuropathologists. They pointed to peer-reviewed studies that directly contradicted the testimony juries had once heard. And yet, prosecutors pushed back. They told judges, these are fringe theories, junk science, hired guns for the defense. They warned that if the courts opened the door to these new arguments, an avalanche of appeals would follow. And for years, judges sided with the state. They upheld convictions, citing finality and deference to the jury. In one ruling, a judge even admitted that while the science had evolved, the conviction would stand because the jury made its choice. Truth, it seemed, was not enough to overcome precedent. But then, in scattered corners of the country, breakthroughs began to emerge. In Wisconsin, the conviction of Audrey Edmonds, an elementary school teacher accused of shaking a baby, was overturned after years of legal battles. The court finally acknowledged that the science had changed. In Illinois, Jennifer Delpreet's freedom was secured after new evidence revealed prosecutors had withheld critical medical records. And in Texas, appellate courts began to question the reliability of SBS testimony altogether. Each victory was a spark, but with every spark, prosecutors fought harder to extinguish the flames. Some states passed laws making it harder to reopen old cases. Others sought to discredit the experts who challenged SBS in court, painting them as radicals. And all the while, dozens of parents sat in prison cells, waiting, hoping, clinging to the belief that one day the system would admit its mistake. But what no one realized was that the appellate battles weren't just about individual cases. They were about something much bigger: the very credibility of forensic science in American courtrooms. If shaken baby syndrome could be wrong, what else might be wrong too? And as judges reluctantly began to reopen the doors, they uncovered something even more disturbing than flawed science. They uncovered evidence of deliberate misconduct, suppressed records, withheld testimony, and a pattern of prosecutors bending the truth to protect convictions. And that would change everything. If evidence shows someone's been wrongfully convicted, should prosecutors fight to preserve the conviction or fight to correct the injustice? Which do you think they're more likely to choose? When the science began to shift, prosecutors across America faced a crisis. For decades, shaken baby syndrome had been one of their most powerful tools, a charge that carried instant emotional weight, built on the testimony of doctors who appeared unshakable in their certainty. It was a prosecutor's dream, and they weren't about to let it go. Instead of embracing the new research, many prosecutors went on the attack. They called the emerging science junk. They accused defense experts of being part of a conspiracy. They told juries that doubting SBS meant siding with abusers. And in some cases, they crossed ethical lines. Hospital records that pointed to alternative medical explanations were quietly withheld. Experts who raised doubts were left off the witness list. And in one case after another, prosecutors leaned on the emotional power of grieving parents and shocking medical imagery, retinal scans, brain-swelling photos, to drown out any whisper of scientific doubt. Because in the courtroom, emotion often wins over reason. But behind closed doors, some prosecutors admitted what they would never say in public. If SBS convictions were overturned in large numbers, the fallout would be catastrophic. Hundreds of old cases would have to be reopened. Families would demand justice. Wrongfully imprisoned parents would sue. The credibility of the justice system itself would be on the line. So instead of reckoning with the truth, the system doubled down on the lie. In appeal after appeal, prosecutors told judges that the science was settled, that the triad of symptoms was still enough, that to overturn these cases would be reckless. And time and again, judges, hesitant to unleash chaos, sided with them. Think about that. Parents and caregivers locked away for decades, not because the science was sound, but because the system was too afraid to admit it might have been wrong. And when journalists, defense attorneys, and innocence projects pushed harder, filing motions, releasing reports, drawing media attention, prosecutors fought even harder. They discredited the experts who challenged SBS, branding them as hired guns. They threatened to revoke medical licenses of doctors who testified for the defense. And in some chilling cases, they suggested that even raising doubts about SBS in court could endanger children by letting abusers walk free. This wasn't just resistance. It was war. A war between the truth of evolving science and the power of a system desperate to protect itself. But what the prosecutors didn't anticipate was that the very fight to suppress the science would only make it stronger. Every battle, every exoneration, every headline made it harder to ignore the growing cracks in the wall. And soon, those cracks would turn into something impossible to contain. The wave was coming. And when it hit, the entire foundation of shaken baby syndrome in the courtroom would begin to collapse. What do you think drives prosecutors more justice, or the need to protect their record of convictions? Be honest, I want to see your take in the comments. For decades, courts had clung to the diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome as if it were unshakable truth. But truth has a way of surfacing, and one by one, the stories of the innocent began to force their way back into the light. In Wisconsin, Audrey Edmonds, once branded a murderer, walked free after appellate judges finally admitted that the science underpinning her conviction had crumbled. In Illinois, Jennifer Del Prete reunited with her family after 12 years in prison, her name cleared by the very evidence prosecutors had once buried. In California, Maria Mendez, a mother accused of killing her own baby, was released when doctors testified that her child had suffered from a rare blood disorder, not abuse. Each case was a victory, but each victory carried a haunting question. If these convictions were wrong, how many more like them still stood unchallenged? The numbers were staggering. By the mid-2010s, hundreds of wrongful convictions tied to shaken baby syndrome had been overturned, vacated, or seriously questioned. Yet at the same time, thousands more parents and caregivers remained behind bars, their appeals denied, their voices silenced. Some had already served decades. Some had lost their children forever. Adoptions finalized while they sat in prison, unable to defend themselves. And the courts, even as they acknowledged the new science, refused to open the floodgates. The human toll was devastating. Imagine being a mother, grieving a child who collapsed in your arms, only to be accused of murdering them. Imagine losing not only your baby, but also your freedom, your reputation, your family, your entire life. That was the reality for hundreds of parents across America. Innocence projects, journalists, and defense lawyers began compiling lists, databases of cases where SBS had been the central accusation. And the more they dug, the more they found. Judges who had once insisted the science was settled were now forced to acknowledge the growing uncertainty. Prosecutors who had once laughed off the defense's experts were now watching convictions unravel in courtrooms they thought were untouchable. The wall was cracking. But here's the darkest truth. Every exoneration was not just proof of one mistake. It was proof of a systemic failure. Proof that for decades, junk science had been paraded before juries as if it were fact. Proof that courts and prosecutors valued finality more than truth. Proof that the very system designed to protect children had been tearing innocent families apart. And as the exonerations mounted, one question became impossible to ignore. If shaken baby syndrome, once treated as unassailable, could collapse under the weight of new science, what other truths in the courtroom were built on nothing but sand? Because while parents were finally walking free, the justice system had not reckoned with the full scope of its failure. It was still clinging to SBS and thousands of active cases, still calling it settled science, still refusing to admit just how wrong it had been. And the reckoning was still to come. Do you think every single shaken baby syndrome conviction should be re-examined? Or would the system fight too hard to protect itself? Let me know what you think below. For decades, shaken baby syndrome was treated as a courtroom gospel. Doctors testified as though they could look at three symptoms, the so-called triad, and declare, with certainty, that a baby had been violently shaken. Prosecutors built entire careers on those declarations. Judges repeated them as if they were fact. Juries believed them without hesitation. And innocent people paid the price. But science does not stand still. As researchers tore into the shaky foundation of SBS, it became clear that this diagnosis was not proof of a crime. It was a theory, a guess, and one that ignored countless other explanations: disease, infection, birth trauma, accidents, even genetic conditions. The collapse of shaken baby syndrome as settled science has left the justice system facing an uncomfortable truth. If experts could be so certain and so wrong about SBS, how many other forensic methods have been paraded before juries as fact, when in reality, They're nothing more than untested, unreliable junk science. Bite mark analysis, arson burn pattern science, hair microscopy, even fingerprint analysis, long thought infallible, is riddled with human error. And yet, courts resist. They resist reopening old cases. They resist admitting their mistakes. They resist acknowledging the lives they destroyed. Why? Because to admit the truth would mean confronting an unbearable reality. That America's justice system is not only flawed, it is capable of manufacturing guilt out of grief, out of tragedy, out of nothing. The reckoning is not just about shaken baby syndrome. It's about trust. Trust in doctors who swore their word was science. Trust in prosecutors who swore they sought justice. Trust in courts that swore they protected the innocent. That trust has been shattered, and rebuilding it will take more than a handful of exonerations. It will take a full-scale re-examination of every case, every conviction, every life stolen by junk science. For every Audrey Edmonds, every Jennifer Delpreet, every parent who walks free after years in a cell, there are dozens still waiting, still pleading, still locked away. Their children have grown up without them. Their names remain stained by lies. Their futures stolen. And until the system is willing to admit the magnitude of its failure, the reckoning remains unfinished. So the question is no longer, was shaken baby syndrome wrong? We know it was. The real question is, will the justice system ever have the courage to admit it? If you believe every family torn apart by this broken system deserves a second chance, share this story. Subscribe to Innocence Uncovered to stand with the wrongfully convicted, and let's demand justice together.